Hey y'all, how's it growing? Did you like what I did there? How's it growing? I love puns. Anyway, I am glad to be back, and it is such a beautiful day outside. The sun is shining, there's a light breeze in the air. It's really nice in the shade. I can't tell you how much it means to me to enjoy such beautiful weather right now, because being stuck in the house for too long gets kind of depressing. All right, so the last time that we chatted, we talked about our part 1 of our series on beginner tips for gardening. And the last time that we talked about planting zones, we talked about the frost date, we talked about planting instructions, and then the seasons as well. So today we're going to jump into the next level of information that I think will help you. So you got your basics from part 1, and now we're getting to a little bit more complicated stuff. So let's talk about where you're going to plant. The good news is, with gardening, you can pretty much garden anywhere you're at. So it doesn't matter if you're in an apartment building with a small patio, or if you have property with lots of land, or something in between those two extremes. You can really garden anywhere and however it fits with what you've got in your situation. So that's what I love about gardening as well. If you're limited on space, there's certainly options there with container gardening. Container gardening has both pros and cons, and you know, I didn't have an all exhaustive list of things for each of these items. And we're going to talk about container gardening, we're going to talk about the raised beds, and then we're going to talk about the traditional in-ground gardening. So the container gardening pros is it's great for limited space. So again, if you are you know, hurting for space, or you live in a small apartment or something, you can get a couple of containers and do it that way. Container gardening is really popular, and I'll tell you a couple of reasons why a lot of people like to do it that way. Other than the obvious, but it is a controlled environment, so you get to control what goes in your containers as far as soil, fertilizer, water, and so that really kind of gives you some peace of mind that you know what is in your food that you're growing yourself, as opposed to, you know, going down to the grocery store and you don't know what fertilizer they use, you don't know what kind of soil they use, so that's a little bit I guess unsettling for some. And so controlling your environment is a big one. Fewer weeds to pull. So if you have a container, obviously you're not having to compete with a lot of weeds. You may get the occasional seeds that get blown into your containers and they start to grow. Easy to pick out, no big strain. The cool thing about container gardening is, depending on where you are, or you know, maybe you have a bad back or something and leaning over all the time is not an option for you, you can raise those containers to the level that's most appropriate for you. It's not permanent, that's a good thing too. So like in my situation right now, because I'm living in a temporary housing situation, I obviously can't be putting anything into the ground or really investing in some raised beds, because I'm gonna have to jet out of here hopefully in the next month. So container gardening is really helpful for me as I transition into the new space. Or if you get tired of the same old hum and drum and you like to change things up, container gardening's great, because you can just move things around, change your containers, so you have a lot of flexibility and creative options for you. It's a great way to start learning. So you know, if you don't want to invest a lot of money up front in the raised beds, or you don't want to break your back trying to jump into the in-ground gardening just yet, I would start with containers, because then you can kind of do some trial and error and figure out if it's something that you really have a passion for, or you start to learn a lot of mistakes in your container gardening. So as you grow and get more knowledgeable in it, and you get more confident in your abilities to garden, then you can transition to something a little bit more permanent. So those are the pros, I would say, for container gardening. There's many more, but those are just a few that came to mind. Another thing would be the cons of container gardening. So one of the things you have to watch out for with containers like this one is that you tend to dry out the soil a lot faster. So you obviously want to have holes on the bottom of the container, so that way the water drains out, but the more that it gets watered, the more the nutrients and all the things that it needs gets washed out, and it tends to get a little bit drier faster as opposed to something a lot larger. So you have to keep an eye on the moisture in your containers. You obviously have to feed more often, because we talked about the water draining out a lot of the nutrients, so you're probably going to have to fertilize a little bit more often than you would with a larger space. And then the last thing about container gardening is it does constrict your growth space. So you know, whether you're doing a container like this or a container like this, depending on the size of your plant and how big it matures to, it could actually stunt the growth of your plant if your container is too small. So pay attention to those planting instructions that we talked about that let you know how tall and how wide the plant's going to be, so you can pick a container that kind of helps that plant grow and doesn't stunt the growth. But you are limited on the space of the container that you grow in. So those are the pros and cons of container gardening. Again, I think it's a great first step, if you ask me. So if you're still thinking about whether you want to try this or you're really scared to jump into it, do it this way. And I think that with little investment, if it goes wrong, you don't feel bad about yourself. Or if as you're learning, you're getting ready to jump into something a little bit more permanent, you'll feel good about it when that time comes. Okay, let's talk about raised beds. So I did raised beds before I did the container gardening thing, so I kind of did a little bit backwards. And that was just because I was super excited and I was determined to figure it out. So raised beds, it looks a lot neater. So when you have raised beds, you can kind of determine your size and where you're going to put them, and you can really make it look pretty neat, as opposed to maybe a traditional in-ground garden where it just, you get a lot of weeds growing, and the dirt is more exposed, and it just looks a little bit messier than it would be if you had the raised bed. And much like the container garden, you actually have a lot more control of what's in it as far as the soil, the nutrients, and all of that. So you have a lot more control of your environment and what you're putting into the food in the ground. It does give you a lot more planting space. So with container gardens, we talked about how you're limited to the container. Similarly to the raised beds, now typically raised beds are much larger. You have a lot more space to work with. So you can do a lot of companion planting. And companion planting is just plants that really enjoy being next to each other. So maybe you have some tomato plants and then you put some marigolds around it to attract the pollinators, and they do really well together. So you can spread your plants a lot further out. Okay, and then much like the container garden, you have less weeds. Now, you don't have as much weeds as you would in an in-ground garden, and you have a little bit more than you would in a container garden, but you still get some weeds, okay? Depending on where you put it and how you build it, you probably have to pick out a little bit more. Some of the cons I will tell you with the raised beds is it definitely is a large expense up front. So I know many of you are probably really excited and you just want to go full throttle and jump right into it. I am that way, which is probably why I started with a raised bed. But if you're a little bit more hesitant or you don't have the funds necessarily to start out up front, then do it the way I mentioned, which is a container first and then the raised beds. But it is a large expense up front, so that's certainly a con. You definitely have to do more watering and more feeding because your space is spread out a lot more. If your plants are too crowded in a raised bed, you do have to be careful that you don't overcrowd your beds, because then that essentially gives you poor air circulation. So if you, again, I always refer to my pruning my tomatoes video, because I learned so many lessons in that video. But I didn't prune my tomatoes, and so what was happening is tomatoes typically want to grow into this big bush, and so I had this big bush of tomatoes and there was no air circulation. It got too crowded in that raised bed. So you have to maintain your pruning and try not to overcrowd your plants in there. All right, the last but certainly not the least is the in-ground gardening, which I mentioned to you in the last video. I'm kind of intimidated by, but yet I'm gonna jump into it and I'm gonna figure it out. The in-ground pros, I will say, is you really don't need to purchase much soil. Now, I caveat that with, it depends on your soil, right, and where you are. So the zone that I am in, 8B, well, let me put it this way. In Texas, we have all types of varieties of soil all throughout the state because it's such a large state. So right now, I am in a part of the state that has primarily sand, believe it or not, and we don't live by the beach, okay? It's just a really weird concept for me, but it's all sand. So I can plant my plants in the sand, but they're not going to thrive on that because it needs to be amended. So I need to add topsoil and some compost and maybe a little bit of clay and get it all mixed up in there, so that way the plants have nutrients and have something to cling to. Because with sand, the water just runs off. It doesn't stick and absorb. like your traditional good soils do. You may be in an area where it's primarily rock, and so you may have to go the raised bed route because you just don't have the ability to do an in-ground garden. Or you may be in an area that has primarily clay, so you're really going to have to work that soil if you're going to do anything in the ground. So I caveat that because you really have to figure out what kind of soil you have before you jump into doing any in-ground gardening. So it may or may not be an option for you. It does allow for your plants to spread out when it's in the in-ground. So one of the ways I'm going to use my in-ground garden in the new house is I'm going to use it for those plants that like to spread out, like the melons, the watermelons, the cantaloupes, the squash, and some of those plant varieties that they just need a lot of space. Whereas a raised bed, although you can grow them in a raised bed, they typically triple over and then they get into your walkways. So that's what I'm going to use it for. Also, you definitely have a lot more plantable space, right? You can pretty much plant anywhere in the ground however you want to plant it. But the cons are the obvious, which is the weeds. You do have to fight more weeds when you do a traditional in-ground garden than you would with any of your containers or raised bed gardens. It is hard on your back and your knees, especially initially when you're having to dig and amend and plant and all that. So you don't have the ability to raise the ground up unless you do a really big mound of dirt, I guess, but that wouldn't really be a logical thing. So if that's something that you need to take into consideration, it may be that you do something that is more practical to your needs, because it is hard work to be on your hands and knees and planting and digging, and although it's fun, it still takes its toll on you physically. So that is certainly a con. It does look a little bit messier, we talked about that, so because of the weeds and some of the other things that you have to fight against, you're essentially fighting with Mother Nature in a lot of ways. The bugs have a much better access. Uh-oh, the dogs came out. Look, come here, Bailey. Okay, that scared me a little bit. All right, where were we? So it looks a little bit messier than it normally looks, right? Because of all the things you're having to fight against, is what I was saying. The last thing is it's a lot easier to get trampled on. So if you have pets or kids and they're out in the garden, they're going to be tempted to trample all over your plants. So you're going to have to put some sort of barrier, which is an additional cost, or do your best to keep them out of the garden, right? Which is hard to do because you want your kids in there with you, I'm sure, and your dogs hanging out with you while you're spending some time in the garden. But that's another con, I would say, with having a traditional in-ground garden. So 3 different ways that you can garden depending on what you've got going on and what your circumstances are. I would look into what works best for you. Don't do what people tell you to do. Do what you think makes sense and what fits your budget, because much like any other hobby, gardening can get very expensive. So be wise in that as well. But you need to start somewhere, and I think you need to dream big. If you have plans to have a homestead one day, or a big couple acre an acre or two, what am I trying to say? If you're trying to have an acre or two of gardening property, then that's exciting, but you're not quite there, you're still in an apartment. We all have to start somewhere. So just gradually and make your way to that, and be patient with yourself and give yourself a lot of grace, okay? Because you're gonna make mistakes. I'm just here to tell you, you're gonna make mistakes. So next time we're going to talk about part 3, which is jumping into soil, and we're going to talk about, let's see, sunlight, watering, fertilizing, and what are some fast growing plants that you can jump into right away and feel good about yourself, okay? Now what I'd like to do before we close out this video is show you a quick update on what I've got going on in the container garden, and some of the things that are popping up in the plants, which I'm really excited about. So let's hop to that. So this is one of the areas that we have the tomatoes, and these are the yellow pear cherry tomatoes and a Dr. Witchy's tomato, and then these here are the onions. They're doing so good. Look how thick these are. I need to eat these onion tops because they're so good in soups and stuff. And these are the ones that we planted from seeds, so they're doing really well. They're slow growers, so if you're looking to grow something quick, onions is not one of those things potentially. Here I have a couple of new plants from my cousin, and these are okras, and then these two are basil plants. So I need to work on getting these a little bit bigger. And then here, this is the pepper aisle, if you will. man, these guys have gotten so big, and I really need to look into how to prune these, because I feel like down here you can see, I mean, they're getting some air circulation, but I'm wondering if I need to chop some of these off so that way the growth can be focused on the fruit, if you will, and not on the leaves. But let me find that pepper. Oh yeah, here we are. Let me show you my mini bell peppers. There's one there. He's getting pretty big. And then there's a bunch of little ones getting started. And then I have like 2 tiny ones right over here. So, yay, peppers are coming in. All right, and these are just the extra pepper plants that I stuck in the soil so they can continue to grow, and maybe I can give these away to someone who is wanting to start some pepper plants. Right over here, now if you have watched my planting potatoes video, these are those blue potatoes, and it's been 2 weeks, and look at the growth. So these potatoes are taking off, and what I really wanted to do, but I haven't had a chance to do, there's Jackson. Say hi, Jackson. What I really wanted to do, and what you should do, is to put some sort of topper on here, like some straw or some leaves or something, so that way the soil doesn't dry out too much, and it helps continue the growth of these tops here. But I just don't have the ability to do that, so I'll just have to grow them like this, which I did the last time, and they did just fine. It just would be nice to have some moisture in there. So the potatoes are taking off and doing wonderful. Check out Pear Bear. Pear Bear's still tall as usual, but I wanted to show you. See that pear right there? There's a bunch of little pears on him. So Pear Bear had to be strapped to this post here because the wind is just so intense, and we had a huge storm come through and he kept getting knocked over, so we strapped him to this pole so that he doesn't go anywhere. But I'm really anxious to get him into the ground so he doesn't get hurt. These are my other tomatoes. These are the Sweetie cherry tomatoes, and they are flowering all over the place, but I wanted to show you we've got some cherry tomatoes. We have some here, and I know we had another set somewhere right over here. You can see right there. So they are doing really good. There's 3 of them planted in this bucket. I don't typically recommend planting so many in such a small space, but I'm limited on space, and so I just make sure that I stay on top of the pruning so they don't get in each other's way. The zinnias are still blooming. This is a fairly new bloom. Look how beautiful that color is. The hummingbirds really love these guys, and I haven't seen very many bees, but the hummingbirds have attacked this. Over here we have the radishes and the lettuce and the spinach that we planted. So the radishes are doing super awesome. Check this out. There's the little radishes. So I'm gonna wait for them to get a little bit bigger before I harvest them. And then the lettuce, you know, if you recall in my last video when I planted these, I planted all along here, but because we had a couple of crazy weather patterns, it disrupted the growth right in the middle here. So I have a couple little babies that are late bloomers, and then I got a little small patch over here, but the majority of it is right here, and it's getting pretty big, so they're doing good. And then the spinach, they're not growing as fast as I would like, and something's starting to chew on them, so I don't know how they're gonna do, if they're gonna survive this. But the radish is great, the lettuce is great, and this container has been a learning experience. I'll tell you why. Because great for the depth of the container to plant something like this, but when you're having to move this container around, the challenge is it disrupts the soil because it's so flexible. Look at that, see that? See how it's breaking right here? And what ended up happening is these guys, I found, were growing in the side because they had fallen in there when I was moving it around. So I'm not sure I like this idea unless, you know, you have a permanent place to put it. Here are my cucumbers, and the cucumbers are just not doing well. They're so sensitive of a plant, I feel like. Now, granted, we have not had the best of weather. We've had a couple of really cold nights, which it doesn't like, and we had a really bad windstorm, so it blew all over the place. I mean, it's hanging on, but it just doesn't look very healthy. So I would say the cucumber's probably not going to do well this year in my container garden. And then jumping over here, lastly, we have some more tomatoes, and these are the Dr. Witchy's, yep, the Dr. Witchy's yellow. And I have four in this container, probably because it's a bigger container. So I've been maintaining the pruning on the bottoms here. You can see there's a lot of airflow, and they haven't quite gotten to the flowering stage, but they got a couple of little buds, so they should be popping up soon. Well, that is a wrap up for part 2 of our series on beginner tips for gardening and a little mini garden tour of what we have in our containers. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope that you share this video or like it or send it to someone you think might be interested in joining the gardening community and growing your own food. We're excited to have you here. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, you guys have a great one. Take care. Bye-bye.